Hello, Dr. B, back for another exciting adventure in the world of evolution, biological evolution. We're going to talk about the evolution of life histories of different organisms in this particular set of two videos. This is chapter 11 in the class textbook. So if we consider the primary goal of any organism, and if you venture outside at the present, you will notice all the birds singing, all the plants growing and blooming, all the pollen in the air from different plants. So we think of the primary goal of organisms to be survival and reproduction, that they want to reach a certain age where they can reproduce and pass on their genes and as many offspring as they possibly can have. There are two forms of reproduction, asexual and sexual. So sexual reproduction involves the fusion of gametes. You see two sweat flies or sweat bees, if you will. They are locked in a mating activity there, and sperm from the male will be deposited into the female to fertilize her eggs and produce more sweat bees or sweat flies. So sexual reproduction involves the production of gametes, sperm and egg, their fusion to produce a zygote, and then development of that zygote back into the individual of that species. The plant here, called mother of thousands, is asexually, without gametes, without sex, is producing little plants in the edges of its leaves. So these involve mitotic divisions, and typically you think that the genetics of this little individual plant would be the same as its parent. You think of asexual reproduction being cloning, whereas you think traits that are inherited on chromosomes, different genes and combinations of genes or alleles can be inherited through sexual reproduction, which might allow for a more genetically variable population, whereas offspring in a population of asexually reproducing organisms will just form a group that has very little, if any, genetic variation. But still, both are very viable and important forms of reproduction and producing offspring. If we consider evolution to be the change in genes, allele frequencies in a population of organisms over time, and that survival and reproduction are key to passing on these genes or alleles, and thus influencing their change in a population over time, then you should consider that the characteristics of an organism, which are called its life history characteristics or traits, they should evolve. And they should evolve in such a manner as to influence an organism's survival and reproduction. So, life history characteristics involve things such as how big does an organism get, how long does it take it to mature, what kind of number of gametes does it produce, what is its fecundity, how does it care for its young, what kind of young does it have? Does it have young that require very little or a very large expenditure of energy? So there's a lot of different life history characteristics that can evolve, and they all tend to evolve in such a manner to result in a highest survival and reproductive effort that can be achieved in the environment the organism lives. We're going to talk about R&K life history strategies and CS&R life history strategies as they apply to animals and plants in particular. So think of some life history strategies, some characteristics that an organism might have, with survival and reproduction being the ultimate goals for that organism. So, biological fitness is the number of genes or the number of offspring that an organism passes to the next generation. Fitness is often related to fecundity. Fecundity is the number of sperm, egg, seeds that either an animal or plant produces. So some organisms have very high fecundity. Male animals and the male human have very high fecundity compared to female. And we'll consider that in the next chapter, chapter 12. So fecundity is a life history strategy. Do you produce a lot of reproductive propagules, or do you produce few? So what is your investment of energy into the production of sperm or egg, or seeds, spores? Another life history characteristic is, how many times do you reproduce in your lifespan? Do you reproduce once? That is referred to as similarity. Or do you reproduce several times, multiple times? That is called heteroparity. Some organisms use all of the energy that they accumulate in their life to reproduce once. And after that reproductive event, they then pass away or die. You see some examples there with insects. So most animals, plants that are called annuals, and there's a fish called salmon that does so. Heteroparity is when small amounts of energy are used to reproduce multiple times. So perennial plants, trees, shrubs, bushes, most vertebrate animals. You see the female pig or sow in the example on the right, and at the bottom left you see two salmon as examples of simiparous organisms. The trade-off with being heteroparous is, when do you mature? An organism that matures early, at an early age, will tend to be smaller, have less survival rate, and produce more offspring in each reproductive event, like a mouse. A late maturing organism will get larger in size, will have a higher survival rate, and will have fewer offspring each time it reproduces. Reproductive effort. This particular slide introduces a few additional terms. How much care do you give your offspring? So each time you reproduce, do you give your care a minimal amount of energy? And those particular young then would be called precocial, and those young would have adaptations such that the parents would not give them much care. The young would be expected to fend for themselves. Most plants are this way, and a lot of animals are as well. Altricial young are born with adaptations that require the parents to invest a great amount of energy to care for them. We are altricial. We were born helpless. Our parents provided us with years of care, taught us all kinds of useful things to help us survive. And this altricial nature that we have is very advanced and only seen in a few groups of mammals, and a lot of the different species of birds have altricial young. So we've talked about some different things that relate to life history characteristics. The number of propagules you produce, how many times you reproduce, do you live to be young or old before you can reproduce? What kind of care and energy do you place into raising young? All of these things result in different traits that develop in different organisms. So, two biologists at Harvard University, Robert MacArthur, when he was a graduate student at Harvard, and E.O. Wilson as a mentor, they came up with R&K life history strategies back in the 1960s. Another person, Eric Pianka, came up with a similar concept while working with lizards. So this slide talks of R selected species, and then in some other slides we talk about K, and then we'll talk about the C, S, and R strategies in plants in the next video. So look at the characteristics for R selected species. The letter R was used to represent the word ruderal or weedy. R-U-D-E-R-A-L, ruderal. So R selected species typically have a small size, a short lifespan. Each time that they produce a lot of offspring. They may reproduce just once, or they may reproduce several times, but each time they reproduce, they tend to have a lot of offspring. They tend to live in environments that are disturbed. They tend to be very good at dispersing. They tend to respond well to disturbance. They tend to live in disturbed areas or environments, but their population may, like waves, may be very variable, just depending upon the conditions of the environment at a particular time. So, small mammals are often considered to be, such as rodents, are often considered to be R-selected species. Annual plants are considered to be R-selected species, or ruderal. Again, the word ruderal is in reference to an organism that tends to occupy a disturbed environment, tends to be very prolific in reproduction, tends to be somewhat weedy in nature. So in the next video we will talk about K-selected species and then the C, S, and R life history strategies that are applied primarily to just plants. Okay, thank y'all and goodbye.